Imagine the sun sinking behind the 7 hills of Rome, and the familiar sounds of the day slowly fading away. But what actually happens when darkness engulfs the largest city in the world? You are standing in a narrow alley in the Suburra district, and suddenly you notice Rome has no street lighting. While we stroll under bright LED lights today, ancient Rome at night was a place of absolute darkness and lurking dangers. Can you imagine the oppressive silence broken only by the echo of distant footsteps or the creaking of wooden carts? The laws of Julius Caesar banned heavy wagon traffic during the day to control the chaos, which is why the night in Rome was by no means quiet, but above all, loud. The rattling of iron tires on the cobblestones and the cursing of the drivers made sleep in the tenement houses almost impossible. If you want to know what history really felt like, and you do not want to miss any of the upcoming time travels, then leave a subscription now and activate the bell. It is definitely worth it for you. Anyone who could afford it stayed behind locked doors after nightfall because crime was omnipresent and the night belonged to the shadows. There was no organized police force in the modern sense to ensure order in every alley, but only the vigiles. This night watch was primarily responsible for firefighting and only acted as law enforcers on the sidelines. If you were mugged at night, you were on your own, and your screams for help often faded unheard into the black emptiness of the alleys. Wealthy citizens never dared to go out alone, but were accompanied by a crowd of slaves who lit the way with torches and deterred potential attackers. Torches were the only means to cut through the darkness. But the night also offered completely different facets of entertainment that only came to life by candlelight and oil lamps. The search for physical pleasure was firmly anchored in the nightly cityscape of ancient Rome and often led you into the notorious Lupaneria. These official brothels were mostly cramped, dark places with stone beds separated by curtains. Lamps in the shape of phalluses hanging above the entrances showed you the way, and the walls were often decorated with paintings that presented a kind of menu of the services offered to the customer. Prostitution was completely legal and taxable in the Roman Empire, but the fate of the women working there was mostly marked by bitter poverty and lack of freedom. Women waited for customers not only in permanent brothels, but also under the arches of the large theaters or the Circus Maximus. These women were disparagingly called fornicatrices because they offered their services in the vaults, the so-called fornaces. The smell of cheap wine, heavy perfume, and the soot of the lamps mixed in these quarters into an intoxicating blend that assaulted the senses. The prices were often scratched into the wall directly above the cells, so that there was no long bargaining, but a quick business transaction in the stuffy darkness. But pleasure was not limited to the shady corners of the Suburra, because the Roman elite celebrated their very own festivals. In the large villas, banquets took place, the so-called convivia, where wine flowed in streams and female dancers provided entertainment for the reclining guests. Here, the boundaries between a social dinner and an extravagant orgy were often fluid. Female and male slaves served exotic dishes while musicians played on the lyre and transported the guests into a world that made them forget everyday life. Some of these banquets lasted until the next noon, and the hosts bragged about how much precious oil was burned in their lamps. But beware, such nights could also be politically dangerous, since any careless word spoken in a state of drunkenness could cost you your head the next morning. Those who had no access to these exclusive circles sought their luck in the taverns where the ordinary people gathered. These popanae were often places of sin where gambling was practiced, although it was officially mostly forbidden. The dice cups rattled on the wooden tables all night long. When you sat there, you had to constantly watch your wallet, because pickpockets took shameless advantage of the cramped space and alcohol consumption. Have you ever wondered how people knew what time it was without clocks? The night was divided into 4 night watches, the so-called vigiliae, the end of each being marked by a horn signal, a dull sound that echoed through the silent quarters and announced the remaining time until dawn. Meanwhile, the vigils patrolled the city with water buckets and axes, always looking for the smallest spark that could trigger a catastrophe. Since most houses were built of wood and mud, a fire at night meant certain death for hundreds of people. The fear of fire was the constant companion of every Roman night, and only the rich in their stone villas felt halfway safe. In the tenement houses, the insulae, families crowded together in tiny rooms and tried to drown out the noise of the street. There were no windows with glass, but only wooden shutters that barely kept out the cold and the stench of the alley. The night air was often considered unhealthy and full of miasmas. Meanwhile, night workers worked hard to ensure the supply of the metropolis. The bakers started their heavy work around 3 o'clock in the morning, kneading dough and heating up the massive stone ovens so that the first flatbreads were ready by sunrise. Waste disposal also often took place under the cover of darkness, when slaves transported the feces away from the public latrines so as not to disturb the cityscape during the day. The sanitary conditions were particularly precarious at night, as many residents of the upper floors simply emptied their chamber pots out of the window onto the street. A nightly walk could therefore end not only dangerously, but also in an extremely unappetizing way. There were even legal treatises on who had to pay for the damage if a passerby was hit by filth. A remarkable detail of Roman legal history. The night was also the time of ghosts and superstition, because the Romans feared the lemures, the restless souls of the deceased who wandered around in the darkness. Everywhere in the city you could see small altars where protective sacrifices were offered to ward off evil and appease the gods of the underworld. The fear of the supernatural was just as real as the fear of the dagger of a street robber. For upper-class women, the night was often the only time of relative freedom, when they were carried in closed litters to secret meetings or religious mystery cults reserved only for women. The Bona Dea celebrations are a famous example of such nightly rites from which men were strictly excluded. But woe to the man who dared to disturb these ceremonies, for the punishments were draconian and could mean social ruin. If you think that the Roman night consisted only of silence, then you are completely mistaken. The city breathed differently at night, almost like a sleeping predator. The sounds of slaves fetching water for the baths, the distant barking of guard dogs, and the constant rumbling of the carts formed a backdrop that never completely disappeared. There was no real rest phase for Rome, as the logistics of a city of millions allowed no pause. Even the large thermal baths sometimes opened their gates at night for special festivities, where the water gleamed in the light of hundreds of lamps and high society amused themselves in the warm steam. Contracts were signed there, affairs were started, and the latest rumors from the imperial court were spread, while the slaves waited outside in the cold. If you wandered through these streets as an ordinary citizen, your most important possession was a small oil lamp made of clay, whose faint glow barely reached 2 steps away. Anyone who had no light was practically blind and defenseless. Danger lurked around every corner, whether from falling structural parts of the often dilapidated tenement houses or from gangs of bored wealthy youths who beat up passers-by for fun. The Emperor Nero himself is said to have been one of these nightly troublemakers, roaming the alleys in disguise and attacking unsuspecting citizens. Can you imagine your ruler robbing you under the cover of darkness? This shows us how lawless the space of the night really was. When the first gray shimmer appeared on the horizon over the Sabine Hills, the energy of the city changed abruptly. The prostitutes went to their meager quarters, the drunks staggered home, and the first clients of the powerful patrons gathered outside their front doors for the morning salutatio. The nightlife of Rome was not a glittering event, but a struggle for survival between noise, danger, lust, and the longing for the first ray of sunshine. It was a world of contrasts where splendor and misery were only a wall's width apart and darkness leveled everything. The rich now slept in their quiet atrium houses, while the mob was already back on their feet to earn their daily bread. Was life in antiquity really as desirable as we often imagine it to be?